Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to join us here at Powderhorn Park Neighborhood Association. We're just going to give it a few more minutes before we launch into our rent stabilization conversation with two amazing folks that I've just had the opportunity to meet just a few moments ago, but that are going to really help to us as a community better understand one of the charter amendments that's going to be on your ballots this election cycle on November 2nd. So if you would just bear with us, we will get started here in the next probably 2 minutes. Thank you again for making the time to join us. I'll just quickly reiterate just a part of what I just shared, because I think we allowed just maybe 1 or 2 more people into the space. We're going to get going here probably in the next minute or so. That'll be about 4 after 6. That just gives us a little bit more time for people to still transition into the space. Thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for your patience. Okay, everyone, why don't we go ahead and get started? Again, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. My name is Tabitha Montgomery, and I serve as the Executive Director over at the Powderhorn Park Neighborhood Association. I really do appreciate you taking the time to join us this evening to hear a little bit more about rent stabilization and the proposed charter amendment, or the charter amendment that will be on this year's ballot in our local election cycle. This evening, we recognize that housing and the idea of access to affordable and accessible housing is not only a very hot topic, but it's an essential part of how we at the Neighborhood Association see community health. Truly a housing first lens in ways, and certainly housing as a human right is something that we are striving to help support with a variety of other community partners who are activists and organizers and people who study how we can potentially chart a better path to that end, not only locally, nationally, and if not globally. With that, I won't spend a lot more time going into some of the background. I know you're mostly here to hear from who we would consider to be more experts in the space to help kind of create a little bit more texture and clarity around the impetus for one of this year's ballot amendments that you will be considering as you head to the polls here in a few weeks. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julia Hobart, my partner in crime here from PPNA. And as a way to kind of just get us started, she has a few questions for our guests, our attendees to consider that she'll direct you to respond to in the chat.
Thank you, Tabitha. Yeah, hi everyone. As Tabitha said, my name is Julia. I also work at the Powderhorn Park Neighborhood Association. And we wanted to just take a couple minutes at the start of our time together tonight to get a sense of who is joining us and allow you all to introduce yourselves. So I have a few questions that I will just share for you in the chat, and you're welcome to respond, a sentence or two and share about your experience. So the first question is, have you lived as a renter in Minneapolis? And if so, is there anything you want to share here about your experience? And this can be, again, as brief as you would like. And you're welcome to share your response in the chat or to just reflect on this as a question to consider how you're approaching this issue and showing up to this event. So we have some folks who have been a renter, someone has been a renter for a number of years. Thank you for sharing. I'll go ahead and share another question. So joining this conversation, what are your concerns about rent stabilization and/or what are you excited about? And I got another response to the first question. Satish has lived as a renter in Minneapolis for about 4 years. That was several years ago. Thanks, Satish. Another person has rented in Minneapolis since 2011. Seems to go up every year. Thank you for sharing, folks. So joining this conversation, what are your concerns about rent stabilization and/or what are you excited about? Again, this can be brief or just something for you to reflect on as we get started here. And then I'm going to go ahead and share the last question. What questions do you have about rent stabilization, about the Charter Amendment, as we're getting started tonight? And we will have time for question and answer later in the event once you've heard from Professor Getz and Qannani Omar. But if you have any questions at the outset, feel free to share them in the chat. As things come to mind, you can share them going forward. So I think with that, we will get started. Oh, I see something from Shauna. I want to know more about how it will help keep the cost of living accessible and not costing over 30% of income. Yes, thank you, Shauna. Julia says, it seems like it could be a tangible strategy to addressing housing affordability in Minneapolis, but she's concerned that it doesn't necessarily address the right problem. Thank you, Julia. Again, you're welcome to share your reflections in the chat going forward. Veronica says, came to educate myself about the amendment, but Minneapolis has a real problem with affordable housing. Yeah, thank you, Veronica. I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and share a story from a Powderhorn Park renter. I had the privilege of sitting down with a few renters that we know at PPNA and asking them about their experiences as renters. So I think we'll start with a video from Sol Battle. So let me just pull that up. You all can bear with me for a moment. Okay. Let's see. So I think I need to do a little bit of troubleshooting here with sharing video. So I'm going to turn it back over to Tabitha to introduce Professor Getz, and then we'll get to some videos in a little bit.
Wonderful, no problem, Julia. Thank you so much. Listen, I just want to say and lift up the fact that I am so grateful that for all of our attendees who shared what you shared, and even if there are other things that you will share throughout the evening, bringing that amount of openness and honesty to this table about your concerns about rent stabilization or what your hopes and aspirations are for what it could do, and also being very aware of things that you might be hearing in terms of unintended consequences. We certainly want to just lift up that this session tonight isn't intended to assuage or to address all concerns or questions, but it's a safe space. We will not disrespect anybody's opinions one way or the other about your views about rent stabilization, but it is really being used as an opportunity to help build more clarity and more understanding so you can make decisions on your own when you are at the ballot box, and perhaps feel confident to be able to share what you know with others in the community. So again, we are very much appreciative of your time this evening. And with that, I'll go ahead and start my intro and my appreciation for Professor Getz taking time to be with us this evening. So Professor Ed Getz specializes in housing and local community development planning and policy. His research focuses on issues of race and poverty and how they affect housing planning and implementation. Professor Getz is a professor of urban and regional planning at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs and the director of the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota. He also led a group of researchers from CURE who conducted a Minneapolis rent stabilization study in February of this year. So I'm sure that there's plenty of other accolades that we could bestow upon Professor Getz. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to him to get going with providing a little bit more context and insight into the topic. Professor Getz, thank you for being with us.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for asking me to be here tonight. It's my pleasure to be here. And thank you for the invitation and the introduction. So Julia, if you could start with the next slide. Very good. So we begin with, we did this study for the city of Minneapolis, and they asked for an examination of the rental market in Minneapolis. And so we looked at roughly the last 20 years of the rental housing market in the city, and tried to get a handle on how it was performing and what it was like for renters, high income renters, lower income renters, or renters right on the average. But we begin with the observation that the city of Minneapolis really is a city of renters, that 44% of the housing units in the city of Minneapolis are in apartment buildings with 4 or more units in them. And then you've got another 23,000 units that are in buildings with duplex or that are duplexes or triplexes. A single family detached is a large component of the housing stock in Minneapolis, but it's really just over 1/3 of the housing stock, and then almost another 10% in single family attached. Next slide, please. But the thing to note about the single family detached is that 10% of those are also rented as well. So we took a look at the rents and how they have behaved over the last 20 years. And the chart that you have in front of you shows the year-to-year change in rents. And we broke it down. The red line is rents in buildings that were built prior to the year 2000. So these are buildings that are 20 years older or older. And then the green line is in newer buildings. And the reason why we did that is that many rent control programs actually exempt new construction for a period of 15 or 20 years or so. So we thought we would break things out because I think the red line represents the part of the housing stock that is most likely to be affected by a rent stabilization program. And the one thing I want to point out in this graph is that these two types of housing stocks really mirror each other in their behavior in terms of rents. You saw rents dip in 2004. You saw them dip again during the big housing crisis of 2009 and 2008. But then you saw steady increases after that. And the thing that I would like to point out is that right around the year 2015, older buildings and newer buildings started to behave differently. We saw the rents dip for newer construction, but they remained high for older buildings. And again, as I noted, these are the buildings that are most likely to be affected by a rent stabilization program. And it's interesting to note that these are the ones that remained high over the last few years. Next slide, please. Now this graph shows the magnitude, the size of the rent increases. And let me help you read. This is not the easiest graph to read. Let's take the year 2002 right here. I think you can see my cursor at the bottom. What this means is that about 12.5% of the rents in Minneapolis increased somewhere between 3 and 5%. This blue corresponds with this blue. And so this amount of units increased by 3 to 5%, but the vast majority of units in the city that year increased less than 3%. And then you can see in subsequent years, it's almost the entire housing stock, the rental housing stock, that increased at less than 3%. So what's interesting, I think, about this slide is that here is where you start to see the really sizable rent increases. The rent increases that are more than 5% and those that are more than 10% are represented here in the darkest blue. And you can see that in the year 2016, almost a third of all rental properties or rental units in the city of Minneapolis saw rent increases that were greater than 5%. And some of them, a sizable amount, 10% perhaps, showed a difference of greater than 10%. And what is different about 2019? 2019, we're not quite sure of yet. We don't know enough about the context for those numbers to find out why we saw so many fewer higher increases during that time. But in any case, what's interesting is that coming out of the housing crisis of the 2008 to 2010 or 12 period, this is where we saw some really significant increases in rents. But again, it was only in a portion of the rental market. Next slide. Now, the question is, if this happened in a portion of the rental market, what portion of the rental market saw the largest increases? And let me draw your attention to the upper right. This is the median renter. This is the renter who has an income right at the middle of the entire distribution of renters in Minneapolis. And we found that between 2009 and 2019, we saw that their rent or their income increased for most of these years at a rate that was greater than their rent increase. So these renters were doing pretty well in Minneapolis, at least after coming out of the crisis period here. They had increases in income greater than they were seeing increases in rents. If you look at the top quartile of incomes in Minneapolis among renters, so the wealthiest or highest income renters, they saw dramatic increases in their income at a rate much higher than any kind of rent increases they were seeing. Where you saw the opposite case is over here on the left. If you look at the bottom quartile of incomes among renters, so the lowest income renters, they were seeing rent increases much higher than their income increases. In fact, what this graph shows is that that this quartile of earners in Minneapolis among renters was actually experiencing lower incomes than when they started in 2006. It was increasing a while, but here is where the real rent burdens were being experienced in the city of Minneapolis in the last 10, 15 years. It was among the lowest income renters. Next slide, Julia. Thank you. This is another way of looking at that same data. If you look at the increase in income for the top quartile of renters, their income increased 54%, but their rent only increased 17%. If you look at the bottom 25%, their rent increased 44% over this period of time, and their income only increased less than 3%. So again, this is just another way of showing you the same data, which is that the real burdens in this housing market, this rental market, were being faced by the lowest income renters. Next slide. Now we break it out by race. Again, we see that on the whole, white renters were seeing increases in income that were greater than their increases in rents. For most of the period of time, BIPOC renters were seeing the opposite. Black, Indigenous, and people of color as renters were seeing incomes increasing less dramatically than rents, although this changed right at the end of our study period in 2019. Next slide, please. But if you break down the BIPOC renters into African Americans and others, we see the real burden here that Black renters in the city of Minneapolis have shouldered, which is declines in income and increases in rents. So again, this is where the worst burdens in the rental market are being experienced. It's among low-income renters and among Black renters as well. Next slide. Another way of looking at affordability is looking at this percentage of income. And I know that one of the questions that we had before we began was, how can we think about keeping rents below 30% of income? Well, this is a graph that shows you the percentage of people who are paying more than 30% of their income, broken down by the household income. And what I want to point out here is that for two of those groups, the pattern has been the same over time. So for people who have incomes, very low incomes, less than 30% of the area median income, it's pretty consistent over all of these years that about half of those households are paying more than 30% of their income on housing. What's also consistent is at the bottom, renters who are making more than 60% of the AMI, a smaller percentage of them are paying more than 30%, but it's also been fairly consistent over the period of time. Where the increase has been shown is right in this middle group, people who are making 30 to 60% of the area median income. We have seen an increase in the percentage of those households who are paying more than 30% of their income on housing. And the question in the chat was, how is the area median income established? And that's a very good question. It does include all of the suburban areas of our metropolitan area. And so the area median income for a family of four is right around $100,000. And so that will give you some idea of the income levels of each of these groups. You can move forward to the next slide. And the next slide is, so then click again. I'm sorry, it looks like these are all, you can keep clicking forward. We did a couple of focus groups with tenants, and there's a couple of things that we discovered. Oops, that's the end. I should have told you when to stop. Great. And the first thing to note is that, of course, tenants and real people don't think about their rents in terms of percentage increase. So if you say, oh, most rents increase 3% or 4%, people are paying real money, real dollars, and they see $50 more or $75 more or $150 more a month. And so what that means is that even 3%, which is seen by experts as being modest, can be a lot of money to renters, especially larger families who are living in more costly 3 or 4 bedroom units. The second thing, and that is the second point. The third is that we heard from tenants who have received multiple rent increases in a single 12-month period, where their landlords have come back to them after 5 months and increased their rents a second time. We heard from tenants that the concern about affordability goes beyond rent, because a lot of landlords are using fees for laundry service, fees for parking, fees for paying your rent online, fees for a lot of different services that actually contribute to an increased monthly cost of housing. And so we need to think about that as well. And then finally, we heard a lot of concerns about lack of maintenance, repairs, and the responsiveness of landlords. And we heard from the folks that we did focus groups with is that they were simultaneously worried about being able to continue affording their unit, but they didn't want to move out because they were worried about their ability to find any other unit that was affordable to them in the marketplace. So this part of our study, which was about the marketplace, is a small part of our overall study, but I think it gives you some sense of how the market had been performing over the last 10, 15 years or so. And so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor Getz, for sharing that information. There will be time toward the end here for, I think, and I hope, plenty of questions from those that are attending about some of the data that you presented. But now I'm going to turn it over to Julia, I believe, who I think has worked out our technology and will be able to share some community voices who took the time to give some insights into their experiences as renters in the city.
Yes, I think I have the technology sorted out. So just give me a second to queue up this first video. 1 moment. Here we go. This is a video from Sol Battle, a renter who lives in Powderhorn Park.
My experience as a renter, I've been hit really hard by gentrification because I was unable to find affordable housing. So I am currently renting out of Airbnbs to avoid being in a shelter. From my perspective, affordable housing is important because it not only helps people in my situation, but it also helps people who are in encampments also be able to achieve housing. So affordable housing means that everybody who wants to be housed gets housed. And that should be the baseline of a civilized society. Limited rent increases each year would help people be more sustainable because rent and the price of other things that have to do with sustainable living keep going up, but pay does not continue to go up. Hours don't necessarily continue to go up either because other people are in control of that side of what's going on. So limiting rent increases can be made to be directly in line with income increases.
Thank you so much, Julia, for sharing that. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker of the evening, who will share a little bit more insight that we hope that you guys who are attending find useful. So it's my pleasure to introduce Qannani Omar, who is a housing organizer with the Harrison Neighborhood Association. She also serves as a co-chair of the Coalition Building Committee with Minneapolis United for Rent Control. With that, Qannani, thank you so much again for your time and being with us. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Tabitha, and thank you everyone who is joining tonight. Just to learn more, I think it's really important to have as much information as possible to make a choice in November, but regardless of how you feel about rent control, I'm really just kind of delighted to see some of the really important statements and questions around the need of trying to make our community accessible for housing for people. Though I am a big advocate for rent control, I have been working hard to make it happen. I realize it's just one tool out of many that we'll need to really have accessible, affordable, safe housing for everyone. I'm also going to, people can feel free to read this later, but just want to drop this article in the chat for people to kind of have an idea, the lens that I'm using. So Harrison Neighborhood Association, Harrison is located in North Minneapolis. It is a population of 3,500 people. It's a small community, but we are a tight-knit community. 70% of residents are renters, and 2/3 of them are cost burden. So in terms of our interest in being a coalition partner with Minneapolis United for Rent Control, that was really coming from the ground up. There was a need for renters as well as homeowners to try to have some autonomy of what's next. The blue line light rail extension was originally meant to go down Old Memorial Highway. With that announcement came a lot of speculation from developers and investors swooping up properties. We had a whole block purchased by one person in a matter of 3 to 4 years, who was then able to sell, displace those people, and then bring in high-priced apartments. So I definitely understand people's concern of not seeing this as seeing rent control as the end-all be-all. I agree with you, but I do think it's an important tool. I can go ahead to the next slide, Julia. And there were some data points here that I'll probably skip over because Professor Getz did such a great job. So I can start with slide 2. Just a little bit of facts so we're all grounded in the same information. Minneapolis is a majority renter city. Over 51% of the city is renting, and 44% of them are cost burden. Like those numbers earlier showed, those who are cost burden are disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and immigrant communities. So as we're talking about rent control, and Merck personally is advocating for universal rent control, I think it's important to highlight that this is a tool to deal with the housing crisis, but also address the racial inequities that we have in our city. Why do we think that rent control or rent stabilization could be a powerful tool? Like the video we just saw, allowing people to have a predictable rent increase that they can plan for annually allows them to do things like save, make long-term plans. It allows them to I think people who live in their communities are invested, but it is difficult when you have children and have to move from neighborhood to neighborhood, chasing cheap rent because things change overnight. Having a rent control policy, when I say rent control, I want to be clear, I'm talking about, similarly to what Professor Getz was saying, is a predictable cap every year that people can expect to pay as leases are renewed. If we had this in place, it would essentially ban price gouging. In Harrison, we saw, and we still continue to see, renters who have affordable housing now, and once their lease is up, are giving notices that their rent is going anywhere from $200 to $400 to even $500 up in rent. That's a significant amount of money that essentially forces eviction. I mean, it's an economic eviction. Most often, our median income in Harrison is almost $34,000. So seeing an increase in 40 to 50% does push people out of their units. There is, I know again, Professor Getz just talked about this, but a lot of concern around rent control is that people point to cities where they see it as not useful or see problems within the system where there's kind of have and have nots of affordable housing, like people will point to New York City and San Francisco. We have, in our conversations as a coalition, we've spoken to policy experts in those cities. We spoke to organizers, we spoke to renters to see kind of why these policies were not as impacting as many people as they should. And we saw that it was essentially because of the exemptions. They were riddled with loopholes and essentially made ineffective. So when we talk about, again, Minneapolis United for Rent Control, when we talk about this policy, we really, again, want to be clear that we're not looking to other cities as a model. We're not looking to San Francisco as a model. We're not looking to LA or Malibu, which each city has their own rent control policy. We're talking about using data that the HERE study provided and implementing a policy that works for people here. We can go to the next slide. So the conversation about rent control, even though the coalition started about 1.5 years ago, I know that Minneapolis has been talking about rent control for decades. My father, went to Augsburg in the early 80s. He remembers people talking about rent control. So I know this is not a new conversation, but I kind of want to give a little context to why maybe it feels like it is actually happening now. We are in a city where the majority are renters. We're in a city where people are struggling in the housing crisis. And the pandemic has exacerbated the situation. And the lift of the eviction moratorium without really strong tenant protections will lead to even a more dire housing crisis. So I think there is an understanding that even in 2019, pre-pandemic, people were not, even if you did have a unit, it is not sustainable for people to spend 50 to 60% of their income on rent. That's what we're seeing in Harrison. We see families who are making less than $50,000 together, spending about $1,800, $1,900, $2,200 on rent. It's just not sustainable. I think there also is an understanding that after the recession, there was exploitative predatory behavior with large corporations securing homes from their foreclosure crisis. Again, specifically in North Minneapolis, there are blocks where there's 400 homes that are owned by one company. And that's a national real estate trust. That being said, there are other landlords that own blocks and blocks in the same neighborhood that are essentially able to manipulate the market because they owned a large bulk of the market. So not having any regulatory policies in place to protect renters in 2009 and 2008, we've seen the implications of that, what that leads to. So as we're talking about the pandemic, as we know that there's economic uncertainty for many, this seems like a good opportunity to implement a policy before things get worse. And as a city, racism has been declared a public health emergency by the city of Minneapolis. We know that Black, Indigenous, and immigrant communities are those most impacted. It seems appropriate and necessary to use this tool now. We can go to the next slide. For the sake of time, I will just kind of speak about what the current pathway to rent control is. So I don't know if people are familiar or looking at what's concurrently happening in St. Paul, but because of our charter, we have a little bit of a different way to get to rent control. There is a ban on rent control at the state level. The only exception to that is if a policy is brought forward on a ballot in a general election and voters vote 51% to make that happen. That is what St. Paul is doing. So St. Paul this past year has collected thousands of signatures with a policy, very similar to what Merck is advocating for. Got the signatures collected and they will be on the ballot in November. If they are successful and they get 51%, I believe their policy asks for an implementation date by May. So if they win in November, rent control will be universal essentially in St. Paul by May of 2022, which is great. Here in Minneapolis, we kind of have a stranger way to get there. We essentially have to give permission. So this vote in November, question 3 on the ballot, is essentially asking residents of Minneapolis if they want to open up the pathway to get to rent control. So there is no policy that's on the ballot. Even if this pathway wins in November, there will be no rent control action. So people will not see caps on their rents. What this allows is a beginning of a time to craft the policy. So if you are still feeling undecided or not sure about rent control as a policy, but you want to open the door and want to be able to continue this conversation, just want to highlight that no policy, no actual change will happen if this charter amendment passes in November. This just opens up the pathway. And again, if we are successful, that allows for city council to create an ordinance to then be put to voters in that same election year. So for example, if November charter question 3 makes it at 51%, City Council in the future could then craft a policy to then be put on the following year. So that could ideally be November 22. It could be November 2023. It also could not happen at all because there's nothing requiring them to put forward a rent control policy. Just because this just gives them permission. So if you are someone who's interested or enthusiastic about seeing rent control happen, I also don't want to make it seem that it's a quick, easy thing to do just to vote yes. It would require you to vote yes, and also kind of engage in the conversation with your city council members, to talk to community members, to organize, because there is no opening a pathway doesn't guarantee that a policy will be put in place in the future. We can go to the next one. This is a charter question or charter amendment question. So just, I put this on here because even though I'm using the word rent control, I think stabilization is the language that city council members are using. But on the actual amendment, it actually speaks to regulating rents on private residential property. So just wanted people to see the question and be prepared to see. Don't be surprised that you're not seeing the words rent stabilization or rent control. Regulating rents on private residential property is what is on the ballot, which does translate to the ability to create rent control policies and rent stabilization policies in the future. We can go to the next one. I kind of touched on this, that when in November opens a legal pathway. The coalition that I am a part of is really hopeful that we will be successful in November and then work with City Council to put something on the ballot in November 22. Again, there's no guarantees on that. That really will be dependent on grassroots organizing and community support. I think that opening a legal pathway is a necessary step, but in terms of implementing a policy that is inclusive and provide support and protections for those most impacted by the housing crisis, that's going to require a larger conversation and a lot of public discussion. So again, if you're interested and want to participate in what will likely be a 1 to 2 year conversation, I encourage you. Powderhorn Park Neighborhood Association seems to be very in touch with housing issues, but there's the coalition has a lot of volunteers, but it will be a people power campaign after November. You can go to the next slide. This kind of touches in terms of Minneapolis United for rent control. We, as I mentioned earlier, we spoke to organizers in California, Oregon, New York. We spoke to policy analysts, just trying to understand how this, and this was prior to the CURA study. So we just kind of wanted to understand what would make sense for Minneapolis. Why were some of these policies in other cities not providing the same results that they wanted? When I say that, I mean Oregon, for example. Oregon actually implemented a statewide rent control policy back in 2019. Organizers were looking for a 3 to 5% cap on rent increases. And what ended up passing was 7% plus CPI, which essentially allows for 10%. A 10% cap was actually celebrated by the corporate landlord lobby and developers, basically saying that they were given the rubber stamp to increase rent at 10% every year, and there wouldn't be any public backlash. So we really wanted to craft and be intentional about what we were asking for. We know the term rent control can mean so many different things. And looking at the Minneapolis housing market, again, in North Minneapolis does not have a lot of density, particularly the northern part of North Minneapolis. 57% of rentals in Minneapolis are single family homes, and that is the bulk of the rental units in North Minneapolis. So as we kind of discussed and heard things from different council members, as well as looked at different cities where they included only large units and excluded single family homes and duplexes, that was kind of worrying since that is the bulk of the rental stock here. We can go to the next one. I think I have maybe a graph or an image that highlights that. So yeah, so this 57% of the housing inventory in terms of rentals in Minneapolis are single family homes, and 32% are duplexes. So if we were to implement a policy that did not include these, it would be the bulk of the rental units here and would exclude many of the renters. We can go to the next one. We can go to the next one. I think this is kind of reiterative information. And that may be it for me. Here is a list of some of our coalition partners. We have several churches, a couple of neighborhood associations, labor groups, and unions. And this is not this has not been updated, but happy to put our website in the chat too for people to take a better look. We can go to the next one. And that is it for me.
Thank you so much, Qannani. Julia, super appreciative for you again taking time to be with us tonight. And just to clarify, folks, before we jump into Q&A, so if additional questions you have for Professor Getz and Qannani, we will take them here just in a moment. But Julia, why don't we go ahead and tee up the second video, I think, from Leigh, or that Leigh provided, since we were a section behind from the beginning.
So this is a recorded interview with Leigh Combs, another Powderhorn Park renter.
My name is Leigh Combs. I live in Powderhorn Park, and I've lived in the castle, which is what we call the building, the apartment building I live in, for about 25 years. Longest place I've ever lived my whole life. My experience here has been amazing. I find that if you have an individual and not a company you rent from, it's much more personable, and it's like family with kids. You know, we have kids and a stoop and all that. And, you know, not everybody wants to buy a home, and not everybody makes enough money. Some people want to do the work they love, and, you know, a lot of work does not pay a living wage. I've been very fortunate that I have a landlord that knows that all the people in this building couldn't handle a big increase. I mean, you know, so for me, it's kept me in my home. I have a home, not just an apartment. It's pretty stressful to think your rent's going to go up $100 a month. People on limited income, people, you know, it means a lot. It means some comfort, some safety, and not some surprise thing that's going to happen at the first of the year.
Thank you. And again, one of the reasons that we've attempted to do that tonight is to make sure that we're bringing renter voices into the space. There's a lot of insight that we each have, and wanting to respect the fact that, you know, at different places in my life or Julia's life and other people's, we may have been renters, but just wanted to make sure that we bring a variety of voices into this conversation. So with that, I know that there were some questions that were happening in the chat. I would definitely want to open up this as a Q&A because it's a pretty small group. I encourage those, if you have questions, if you want to come on video or not, and just come off mute. If you have a specific question for Professor Getz or Qannani, we would welcome those at this time. And one of the things maybe that I will do as people are percolating up a thought is just to ask my own question. And it's not to put you on the spot. I don't know, and that's something we can look into. Is always a right answer, quite frankly. But for me, it's really related to this bigger construct outside of one of the tools and even the possibility of rent stabilization or rent control is the overall cost of the moment that we find ourselves in. So one of the things that I saw in the chat, which was great, was a person's questioning whether or not that this will help keep, rents to only 30% of area median income. But the data that Professor Getz had already shared would suggest that that's not necessarily the case. It's not a cure-all, and it's not going to reduce what people are already experiencing as a cost-burdened reality, a cost-burdened truth of significantly more than 30% of their income going toward housing-related expenses. So just wanted to ask Qannani and Professor Getz if you could speak into what you are aware of or have found through some of the research and conversations that you have is really the cost of the city of Minneapolis' current housing crisis, to give it some context for those who have been able to join us tonight.
Sure. I mean, I think the 30% threshold is one that is used by the government to define what is affordable housing and what isn't, and it's used then to also determine what the rents will be in government subsidized affordable housing. And a rent stabilization program does not really work in that way, right? It doesn't address how much of a household's income is being paid on rent. What it addresses is how much that rent can change one year to the next. And so I think, you're absolutely right that it doesn't really address this issue of affordable housing. But I think, as a number of people have noted, rent control or rent stabilization is just one of the tools that we need. But it is true that if the city were to move to a rent stabilization kind of program, it wouldn't guarantee rents at 30% of income. It would simply modulate the increases from year to year.
Thank you, Professor Getz. And maybe I'll just restate my question, because I think that that's spot on. And wondering, though, is there any data that you are aware of or that can point to in terms of what would the cost be on community, specifically maybe the city of Minneapolis or another municipal or another degree of jurisdiction, to move the number of people who are currently cost burdened out of being cost, to really have more affordable, accessible housing to actually meet that need from an affordability perspective. So I guess my question is really about that affordability piece, recognizing rent stabilization is a thing that has value and constraints depending on who you listen to. I certainly believe that it has value, and I also believe it has limitations. So that's kind of really the heart of the question, meaning how much would it cost us to get out of our current reality of how many people, even with rent stabilization, will struggle or continue to find it challenging to meet the rent.
Right. Sorry, I missed your question on that. I think that, the statistics that Qannani provided, which is that, more than half of all renters in the city are paying more than 30%, I think suggests that the number is quite large. I have not ever seen research that tries to estimate what that cost would be. And as you ask that, I wonder to myself why I've never actually seen research like that. It seems like such an important question to ask. I think there might be ways of estimating it, but the short answer is we haven't done that. I don't know the answer to that.
It's good I have new friends in positions like yours that consider how do we get at that question. And just again, as other people are maybe considering questions for you and or Qannani, I think that the impetus for that is, I think that having that insight can help us as community, especially advocates for housing equity and justice, be in a better position to even push back, challenge respectfully, or produce positive pressure when we're hearing about the degree of investments that different municipalities are making into housing, when we know that that often will not even scratch the surface of the need in order to effectuate what you described as that real, dollar and cents reality for a household. It's not that they think in percentages, they think in terms of, do I have an additional $20 this month to pay this increase or this additional $50, or as the thought that Leigh just left us with, 100. Qannani, I'm going to come over to you maybe in just in terms of a question as it relates to next steps. If you and your coalition have begun to think about next step, whether the ballot, the charter amendment or the ballot language advances, or if it does not. And just wondering if you could speak a little bit into what do you see the role is in either lane for those who have been able to join us tonight.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I am pleased to say that even though we are hopeful that it will pass in November, we have talked and discussed the reality of what's next if it doesn't. Prior to City Council taking this up this January, the coalition that Minneapolis United for Rent Control, before the council opened up these pathways, our initial pathway was actually a legal action. So we have members who were participating in the 15 Now fight. I was not there myself, so don't want to present a narrative that's false. But the reason why we're not able to pursue the same pathway that St. Paul is in terms of putting the policy on the ballot ourselves, collecting signatures, putting a policy on having voters decide, the reason that was blocked was due to a Supreme Court case in relation to the 15 Now fight about whether their ballot could be, or their question could be on the ballot. So all that to say is, that's not a great answer in terms of we're going to go get a lawyer, but there are different strategies that we had in place prior to these pathways, which are a little bit easier in terms of time and resources. So the conversation is certainly not over. All of our coalition partners are very, very want to see this advance and are persistent in terms of having something happen in 2022. If we are successful, if we do get 51%, our goal is to organize citywide, have town halls in all the neighborhoods, and really create and build out a larger movement of people who, like some of the comments I'm seeing here, don't necessarily see as rent control as the end all be all, but know that it's a tool that we need to use. In Harrison specifically, though we're fighting for it and we want rent control to happen, it is not going to address what Tabitha, you kind of mentioned with people being cost burden. 2/3 of this, there's 70% renters, and 2/3 of them pay close to 50% of their income on rent. If we get rent control tomorrow, that doesn't change that for them, that they're not in a sustainable situation with housing where they can save, where they can possibly purchase a house, or even have enough to save up for an emergency if something happens with their car or medical emergencies. So that reality doesn't change with rent control. That being said, it is difficult to offer, it is difficult to organize around things when you have your neighbors leaving every few months. So another scenario I want to offer is that we have a building in Harrison that the tenants have unionized. In response to that public union, they have received rent increases, and some of those tenants are able to absorb them and some of them are not. And already they've lost, I think, 6 members that are part of that union. And what's being brought in are new people who don't really understand what's going on, are not necessarily realizing that though this may be a steal for them, it is significantly much more than what their neighbors are paying, and makes things uncomfortable and tense. And though we should welcome those tensions, making the playing field even would be implementing a rent control where people could at least predict and plan for when they want to move versus being kind of forced out and overnight.
Thank you so much. Yes. So Julia, are you teeing me up for this question? Yeah, so one of the things that was asked previously or earlier in the chat is so that I'm concerned about the potential for unintended consequences, for example, inducing landlords to neglect property upkeep. Would either one of you want to speak to that, unintended consequences, or specifically how the idea of rent stabilization and or rent control could somehow negatively influence property owners to neglect property maintenance?
So I'm going to put this in the chat as well. This is a great article in MinPost that goes into more depth than what I'm going to talk about, but I bet Professor Getz has more details. But in what we've seen, there has been no studies nationwide that can link rent control to poor or I don't want to say landscaping, upkeep. There has been, I think, a slowdown in some of the cosmetic repairs that we see. And by repairs, I mean laminate or granite countertops and some of those things that usually result in a higher rent increase. But there has been no studies that we've been able to find that can link landlords then allowing their properties to become awful because of rent control.
So, right, I would echo that. I think that most of the studies of rent control programs that are in place show that at the most, there could be some impacts on cosmetic elements of the building, right? But most rent control programs allow for major maintenance costs to be passed through. And the St. Paul proposal does that, and I would assume that anything considered in Minneapolis would do the same thing. But it does require the landlord to document that this was a needed improvement, and then it requires the landlord to amortize that increase per resident over a series of months, right? So that there's not a real shock in terms of a higher rent, but that the cost is spread out over many months over all of the tenants. And that's usually a pretty standard element in most rent stabilization programs, which is why you don't see that kind of outcome. I will say one other thing, though, that one of the unintended consequences that you do sometimes see is landlords or developers or owners taking their units off the market altogether, either converting them to condominiums or even demolishing them, because if a rent stabilization program exempts new construction, some landlords may think that it would pay to demolish their existing building, build a new one, and it will be exempt for the next 15 or 20 years. That has been seen in other places, and all that means is that if you're going to think about rent stabilization, you also need to think about other programs to put in place to complement rent stabilization so as not to lose that kind of housing stock. And a lot of places have initiated condominium conversion controls and demolition controls as well. And so that's something to think about as well.
Wonderful. Thank you for those responses. And the one thing that I would do and chime in and say that we can provide to those who have been able to attend, I'm unable to figure out how to drop it into the chat because it's actually saved to my personal drive. But one of the ways that PP&A came into this community issue, one of the ways was initially in partnership with the Minneapolis Renters Coalition. And the Minneapolis Renters Coalition, one of the things that it was advocating for in the beginning years that I was a part of it through this organization was an increase in oversight through regulatory services. And specifically to this idea that potentially rent stabilization or rent control would somehow dissuade property owners who are already doing a good job of maintaining their property not to. And there's already enough evidence to say that they don't need any more incentive, because there's plenty of tier 3 and tier 2 properties that exist in predominantly BIPOC neighborhoods to the tune of 28%, where over 26% of persons of color reside. And it's like a heat map. And so that's the It's a piece of collateral that we were using to kind of explain the rationale for why HIS inspectors, housing inspecting services, and FIS needed to increase to provide more oversight of those properties that, to be fair, if you're in tier 3, you are expected to be assessed on an annual basis, versus if you're in a tier 1, I think that that's only an every 8 or 9 year review. But was there any other questions that you noted in the chat, Julia, before?
Yeah, I just saw one from Veronica. They asked, not represented here tonight, but who is against this? What are their talking points, and how do I rebut what I may see if I seek out that information? I think that's a great question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Professor Getz, Qannani, any thoughts?
Well, so I'll go first this time, sorry. Certainly the real estate industry is against it. Their talking points generally have to do with, expectations about supply and demand, and about limiting profits, and about producing disincentives for people to build housing or to build rental housing, disincentives for owners and landlords to maintain the properties, and so that those are their talking points. Is that this ends up killing the local rental market, we did in our study we interviewed 30 people from the development industry, and we heard all of those reactions. And I guess the response, the response to their talking points is that, at least my response to their talking points is that there's a big difference between what economic theory suggests might happen in an ideal case versus what actually happens with most rent stabilization programs. Most rent stabilization programs allow, as we described, for the pass-through of costly maintenance items. Most stabilization programs cap rents at a rate of increase. It doesn't cap them absolutely, so rates of return are allowed. So the reality of rent stabilization in most places is different than the worst fears of most developers and owners, is what I would say.
Thank you, Professor Getz. Qannani, would you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I guess I would add, just because I've actually have received mailers from the opposition, and they seem to be, I think, at least what I observed in the two mailers I've seen, is that the assumption is the policy portion in Minneapolis, it would be similar to something you would see in New York. And the reason I say that is because there is language saying that, okay, rent control may be good for the people who get into these units, but it's going to be bad for everyone else. And I guess my response to that is, again, this is not on the ballot, but a universal rent control policy would provide that benefit for everyone. Having predictability as a renter in the city, regardless of whether you're in the bottom 30%, 40%, 50% of AMI, I think provides stability that people should be entitled to. So in terms of the language that you'll see, it will be assuming things about the policy that aren't necessarily true. And I'm happy to, in the chat, I'll put the link to some we've made frequently asked questions about rent control that I'm happy to share. But just wanted to note that there is no policy again this fall. So it's interesting that they have chosen to pick talking points about cities that isn't at play right now.
Well, and a couple of things that I would say and share and ask even Professor Getz is that, so thank you, Professor Getz. You see that question from one of our participants, Greg, who has joined us. Hi, Greg, by the way. But I want to just call out that not having the opposing view tonight here, or the opinion tonight wasn't necessarily to discount the idea that people oppose rent stabilization or rent control. We really believe that the more information and insight and information that you have that's fact-based is of benefit. And I think that some of it is related to our organization as trying to host this meeting have not come in contact with a lot of groups who have what we would consider to be fact-based insight on why this should not be at least explored. And the second question that you asked, Greg, specifically around the number of units that potentially the ordinance or future policy could restrict in terms of 6 buildings, that's a great question, and yet another opportunity for us to say that the ballot language does not equal policy. It is really only creating a possibility of the city council taking further action with creating a rent stabilization mechanism that would still, they could choose to enact with or without a citizen's vote. So there's not a way to really answer that outside of saying we're not that far yet, but the language, because of the state preemption, is needed in order for the city to even consider rent stabilization policies or rent control policies that could serve this particular community. Good to see you. Let's see. And then so Professor Getz, are you comfortable with us sharing a way for those who have attended tonight? You could drop it in the chat if people have more detailed questions specifically about the study that you conducted and oversaw, or other questions that they believe that you might be able to answer in that regard. I think that that would be helpful. Certainly, because we're not experts, even though we pretend to be one on TV, typically between the hours of 7:13 and 7:30, and then it just stops. You know.
All right, that's about as long as I also pose as an expert. There's my email in the chat if anyone has specific questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And the other thing maybe I will offer, if Qannani and Professor Getz have come across what I would consider to be compelling and rooted in fact-based insight kind of data in terms of rents and impacts that rent stabilization or ordinances have had, I think it would be great if you could pass that along to us, and we will share that with the community. Because again, sometimes these reports are dozens, hundreds of pages of long, which is not to dissuade, but it really then means just go through it with a fine-tooth comb to make sure you're understanding how they're interpreting the data. Any other questions or thoughts before we maybe move close to wrapping up tonight's forum? Okay, seeing none. What I want to do before, and I will maybe save the final comments to the end, but we have one more video where we partnered with a community member who is a renter, who we asked to share their thoughts about this idea of rent stabilization. Julia, if you could tee that up.
This video is a conversation with Brenda Marcos, so I'll go ahead and play that now.
My experience as a renter in Minneapolis has been very difficult. The last time I was looking for a place to live, I have a felony that is 18 years old. I was turned down from 2 different apartments because it was a prostitution charge, and they claimed it was a sex crime because it involved sex. So an 18-year-old felony, you can go back that far. And at that time, I had clean clothes for all. I am also mandated by Human Services where I can work with vulnerable adults, children, but they wouldn't rent an apartment to me. Okay, another thing that's really hard is the rent income. Some places want 3 times the amount of the rent. They go by your credit. And if you're just if you're getting out of domestic abuse relationship, your credit is really bad, but you know that you're a good person, and a lot of times people don't want to give you a chance. Everybody deserves housing. It doesn't matter who or what they are, everybody deserves housing. And right now, this so-called affordable housing that they hook to new apartment buildings and stuff is not affordable. Okay, they only take a little percentage of those apartments, and they're still not affordable because they're going at 80% AMI and 90% AMI. And AMI stands for the area medium income, and they take the 7 counties and divide that. They don't go by zip codes. And like I said earlier, you can't tell me somebody over in North Minneapolis is making $68,000 a year. Over in South Minneapolis, you can't afford it. Just like, you know, I'm making $16 an hour, and doing 30% of my income is almost $800 a month. Okay, the apartment I have right now is $930 a month plus $60 parking. So that is way over my 30% of my income. So affordable housing is very important because we all deserve housing. It doesn't matter if you're using drugs. It doesn't matter anything. Everybody deserves safe, affordable housing. Limited rent increases, if minimum wage is going up, if pay increase is going up every year, that could be understandable. Then, you know, gradually raise the rent. But if a minimum wage isn't going up, if your pay increase isn't going up, if Social Security isn't going enough for rent increase, then how is it that they get to keep raising rent, but we're not making any more money to pay for it? So again, the rich keeps getting richer and the poor stay where we're at because the society is made to keep us down.
You know, I know Brenda and for several years, and I would love to let her have the last word. And yet I know that there are many people that we would want to thank. And specifically because before I do that, some of the things that Brenda brings up, it just points to how complicated this issue is, and then sometimes how simple the issue is. There is a nature of complexity to the things that we need to be in the position to be able to explore as a community to figure out how do we get to a place where everyone that we see and that we interact with and who takes up oxygen and space in this world has a roof over their head, has access to safe and affordable housing. That is a real thing, and that's something that PPNA supports. Our board of directors has supported the advancement of approving the rent stabilization, a pathway to an ordinance and or policy, because we believe that the community should have the opportunity to have all the things in its arsenal that makes the reality and the truth of what it means to have housing viable for people in the city of Minneapolis. With that, I can't say enough how appreciative that I am that Julia has the relationships and the foresight to invite persons like Professor Getz and Qannani Omar to be with us tonight. We certainly are grateful for each and every participant who was able to take time out of your evenings to be with us. This recording will be made available probably through our YouTube or Facebook channel. And we are open to answering other questions or pointing you toward persons who can answer additional questions that you might have as you prepare to educate yourself for some very consequential votes on November 2nd as it relates to our overall community health and livability. So again, Professor Getz, Qannani Omar, you have my deepest appreciation on behalf of the board and the entire staff, and to everyone who took a little bit of your time to be with us tonight. Thank you. We look forward to seeing you again.